It all started with a single envelope. It wasn't a package from Amazon or the birthday card I was waiting on from my sister. No, this was far less welcome. Bold letters on the outside read, "Notice from the Blackwood Estates HOA." I sighed. Nothing good comes from an HOA notice. My neighborhood wasn't exactly high drama, but a few overzealous enforcers liked to act as if they were heading up the neighborhood branch of the FBI. I opened it cautiously, holding my coffee in the other hand like armor. Apparently, according to the letter, my grass was 2.5 inches too high during last week's inspection. Seriously, who measures this sort of thing? And I owed them a $79 fine as a result. The kicker: they also demanded immediate payment to remain in compliance. Failure to pay, they warned, would result in escalating consequences. My blood pressure spiked. It wasn't about the money. I could pay $79 without blinking. It was the principle. I always kept my yard tidy, and no one in their right mind would notice a tiny deviation in grass length. This was the kind of bureaucratic pettiness that made people despise HOAs, but instead of paying, I decided to ignore it. Honestly, I had bigger things to worry about as the recently promoted chief of police. A week passed, and I'd forgotten about the whole thing. That was, until Friday morning came with an unpleasant surprise. I was getting ready to leave for an important meeting downtown when I noticed two vehicles parked across the entrance to my driveway. I frowned. They looked official, but not police official. White SUVs with Blackwood HOA enforcement stenciled on the side in blue letters. I grabbed my coffee and walked outside, confusion turning to irritation as I saw three people in reflective vests standing near my mailbox, arms crossed as if they were straight out of a bad reality show about mall security. "Can I help you?" I called out as I approached. One of them, a wiry man in his 50s with a clipboard, stepped forward. He adjusted his hat, which was clearly trying, and failing, to look like something a real officer might wear. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, glancing at his clipboard like he needed to confirm my identity. "You failed to pay your outstanding fine of $79. We've been instructed to restrict access to your property until the debt is resolved." I blinked, sure I hadn't heard him correctly. "You're blocking my driveway over a $79 fine." "Correct." He sounded proud of it too. "We take compliance very seriously here at Blackwood Estates." For a moment, I just stared at them, dumbfounded. They weren't just parked there for show. They had literally chained a reinforced metal barrier across the entrance to my driveway. "You can't possibly think this is legal," I said, gesturing to the blockade. One of the others, a woman with a tablet, chimed in. "Section 14, subsection C of the HOA Code allows for enforcement actions when members fail to address violations. You were notified." "Oh, I was notified, all right," I said with a laugh. "But none of this is enforceable. Also, I'm pretty sure what you're doing counts as trespassing." "Not according to our lawyers," Clipboard said smugly. If they'd bothered to run my name before showing up, they probably would have realized their colossal mistake. But instead, I was standing there in sweatpants, looking like any other irritated suburbanite. I crossed my arms, suppressing a grin. The situation was so absurd that I almost wanted to see how far they'd take it. Almost, but I didn't have time for games. "Okay," I said, pulling out my phone. "I'll just call this in." Clipboard raised his eyebrow. "Call it in? To whom?" I smiled then. "Oh, just the local police department. You know, the one I run." The silence that followed was frankly incredible. Clipboard's confidence faltered for a moment before he straightened up, clearly trying to recover. That's unnecessary. We're just doing our jobs." I raised an eyebrow. "Your job is extorting $79 by illegally blocking private property. I'd rethink your career choices." The woman with the tablet was already backing toward one of their SUVs. The third guy, the strong, silent type, suddenly found the sidewalk very interesting. "Look," Clipboard said, his tone getting defensive now. "We're authorized by the HOA to enforce regulations as necessary." "Sure," I said, "but the HOA can't override actual laws. Did it occur to you that what you're doing could lead to a criminal charge? This isn't small claims court. It's a crime scene. You should probably unchain my driveway right about now." Before they could respond, my phone lit up. I wasn't actually calling 911. I didn't need to. But my Lieutenant Angela picked up on the first ring. "Chief," she said cheerfully. "What's up?" "Hey, Angie, just a quick question. What's the penalty for trespassing coupled with illegal restraint?" Her tone instantly shifted to concern. "Who's trespassing on you?" "I'll explain later. Could you send a couple of patrol cars to my place? Some HOA enforcers decided they'd play traffic cop this morning." Angela didn't even try to hide her laughter. "On it. Should I bring donuts?" Clipboard's face went pale as I hung up. 15 minutes later, 2 marked patrol cars rolled into the neighborhood. By then, the HOA team had moved their SUVs, but I insisted they leave the barrier where it was. I wanted my officers to see exactly how far this nonsense had gone. Angela stepped out of the first car, sunglasses hiding the amusement in her eyes. "Morning, Chief. Nice barricade you've got here." "Courtesy of Blackwood Estates HOA," I said, motioning toward the now awkward trio huddled near their vehicles. Clipboard immediately launched into a speech about policies and bylaws, but Angela silenced him with a raised hand. "Sir, do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" "Of course I do," he sputtered. "This is Mr. Reynolds, and he was legally notified of a violation." "No," Angela said with a grin. "This is Chief Alex Reynolds, Chief of Police." The words hit them like a freight train. Clipboard's confidence evaporated. The woman with a tablet had somehow shrunk 2 inches. Even the silent one looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Now," Angela continued, "I suggest you remove this barrier before we start discussing charges. Trespassing and unlawful restraint are a bad look for an HOA." It didn't take much convincing after that. The barrier was dismantled in under 5 minutes, and Clipboard muttered an apology before speeding off with his team. Angela and I shared a laugh as we watched them go. By Monday, word had spread all over the neighborhood. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, and Clipboard was relieved of his enforcement duties. I found out later that multiple neighbors had started petitions to review the HOA's practices thanks to this melodrama. As for me, I never got another fine from Blackwood Estates. Turns out even the most power-hungry HOA knows when they've crossed the wrong driveway. By midweek, my little driveway drama had practically turned Blackwood Estates into a live soap opera. Neighbors who previously waved in passing but avoided more than a polite hello now stopped me during my morning jog to chat. "Did they really block your driveway?" asked Susan, who lived 3 houses down. "You called the actual cops on HOA folks." Another neighbor, Todd, whispered, as if his house might be bugged. The highlight came when Jim, an older man who spent most of his days pruning his rose bushes, ambled over to me one evening. He chuckled, crossing his arms. "Alex, I've lived in this neighborhood 20 years. That's the first time I've seen anyone put the HOA in its place." Bravo. It wasn't long before others admitted that they too had been victims of outrageous fines or overly strict rules. Overgrown hedges, unapproved mailboxes, lawn chairs left out overnight. One woman even confided that Karen Simpson, the president of the HOA, had threatened to fine her for her teenage son's basketball hoop because it disrupted the aesthetic harmony. No one had stood up to them before. Most people didn't want the hassle or couldn't afford the fines piling up. But now they saw a chance. Soon murmurs of rebellion spread. A neighborhood WhatsApp group, previously reserved for lost pets or bulk buying mulch, buzzed with heated discussions. "Why are we paying this HOA so much? What are they actually doing for us?" Todd typed one evening. His message was followed by a stream of thumbs ups. It felt like the perfect opportunity to dig deeper. Angela caught me in the station the next day, dangling a cheap-looking paper binder. "Thought you might want to see this," she said with a sly grin. "What's that?" "The HOA's bylaws, such as they are," she replied. "I asked a friend at City Hall to pull public records. Spoiler alert, they're a mess." Opening the binder, I wasn't surprised. Half the clauses were vague enough to be practically meaningless, and the others seemed tailor-made for abuse. It wasn't just the bylaws either. A quick check on the HOA's finances turned up some shocking details. Over the past 2 years alone, fines and fees had doubled. But where was that money going? Certainly not community improvements. Several planned maintenance projects had mysteriously fizzled out, leaving potholes unfilled and common areas neglected. The documents revealed another bombshell. The HOA's treasurer and enforcer-in-chief, Clipboard Carl, whose real name I finally learned was Carl Simmons, was also involved in landscaping services. Apparently, fines were routed through a preferred vendor clause, and Carl just happened to own one of those vendors. "Oh, this is juicy," Angela said, peering over my shoulder. "This is corruption, is what it is," I muttered. We knew we needed more evidence, but for that, we'd need someone on the inside. A knock on my door that evening turned up a familiar face. It was Brady, the quiet HOA enforcer who'd been there during the driveway blockade. He stood stiffly on my porch, clutching his hat in one hand like a teenager caught sneaking out past curfew. "Mr. Reynolds, Chief Reynolds, can I talk to you?" I stepped aside to let him in. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he started. I didn't know. When they asked me to help with enforcement, Karen and Carl told me we'd only be addressing real problems. Like safety hazards or violations that could hurt property values. He shook his head, red-faced. "But after what happened at your place, I started looking closer. None of this feels right. I didn't sign up for this kind of stuff." I leaned back, arms crossed. Brady struck me as sincere, if more naive than the average adult. "Why are you here, Brady?" "I want to help," he said earnestly. "I know where they keep the records, the real ones." Brady wasn't exaggerating. Late that night, armed with only a flashlight and a notepad, we snuck into the HOA's storage room, legal thanks to a warrant I'd pulled. Inside we found mountains of unsorted paperwork. At the bottom of an old filing cabinet were folders that tied everything together. Thousands of dollars in fines and fees had been funneled into administrative costs and discretionary improvements, which just so happened to coincide with Carl's landscaping company's new office downtown and Karen's recent purchase of a convertible. Even more damning, some of the fines they'd issued to certain residents had no legitimate justification. Grass height violations were laughable compared to the fabricated claims of unregistered guests and unauthorized modifications. It was a web of deceit, and now we had the proof. Brady looked over the evidence with wide eyes. "I can't believe they were getting away with this." "Not anymore," I murmured. At the next HOA board meeting, the room was packed. Every seat was filled, neighbors spilling out into the hallway, buzzing with anticipation. Karen Simpson sat at the head table, flanked by Carl Simmons and a few other board members. Her sharp smile wavered slightly when she saw me walk in, binder in hand. "I believe we should add a new point to the agenda," I said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Misappropriation of funds and fraudulent enforcement practices." The murmurs turned to outright gasps. Karen quickly regained her composure. "This is highly irregular, Alex. We have an agenda to follow." "Oh, I'm sure the neighborhood will want to hear this," I countered, setting the binder down in front of her with a satisfying thump. For the next 15 minutes, I laid it all out. The fake fines, the misuse of funds, the kickbacks to Carl's company. Angela, seated in the crowd, chimed in with legal references whenever Karen tried to interrupt. Brady stood by my side, his head high, and his voice steady as he corroborated every claim. By the time I finished, Karen's carefully curated air of control had crumbled. Residents were on their feet, demanding answers, calling for her resignation. Carl made a show of slipping toward the exit, but not before Angela intercepted him. "Sorry, Carl, I think you'll want to stick around for this part," she said, handing him a subpoena. A special election was held a week later to install a new HOA board. Karen resigned under pressure, and Carl faced charges of embezzlement. Meanwhile, the community voted to revise the bylaws, making them more transparent and less punitive. Brady, despite his earlier lapse in judgment, earned the community's respect for blowing the whistle. He took a position as the neighborhood's new liaison, promising to help rebuild trust. As for me, I became something of an accidental neighborhood hero, though I was happy to fade back into my quiet life. My neighbors jokingly called me Chief of Blackwood now, but at least my driveway stayed clear. That $79 fine, still unpaid, but no one dared bring it up again. The end. The story has been continued with new twists, deeper drama, and a satisfying resolution. Let me know if you'd like to explore any other angles or expand further. The fall of Karen and Carl felt like a victory, but as the dust settled, we realized the hard work was just beginning. The HOA board had been left in shambles. With Karen gone and most of her loyalists resigning out of either shame or fear of further investigation, the neighborhood was officially leaderless. "Good riddance," Todd declared at the next neighborhood meeting, only to be met with scattered applause and some awkward silence. We all knew someone had to step up and take the reins, but enthusiasm was, understandably, low. After everything that had happened, who could blame people for being wary of the HOA? "I can't believe I'm saying this," Susan piped up, crossing her arms. "But maybe the HOA isn't the problem. It's the people who were running it." She wasn't wrong. An HOA, when done properly, could help manage common areas and keep things running smoothly. But no one was eager to take responsibility, and finding competent, ethical people willing to lead the new board felt like finding a needle in a haystack. "I guess we could just not have an HOA anymore," Todd mused. "Sure, and next thing you know, someone's putting plastic flamingos on every lawn and parking RVs in driveways," Jim retorted. It was clear that restructuring the HOA was going to be a challenge. That's when an unexpected volunteer cleared his throat at the front of the room. "Brady." "If no one else is interested," he said, his voice steady despite the murmurs rippling through the crowd, "I'd like to run for president of the new HOA." A year ago, the idea of Brady leading anything would have been laughable, but since aiding in Karen and Carl's downfall, Brady had grown into someone the community could genuinely trust. He'd spent the last few months helping neighbors untangle their disputes with the HOA, walking elderly residents through appeals processes, and even mowing lawns for folks who'd gotten fined in the past. "I'm not Karen," he said earnestly at the meeting, "and I'm sure as heck no Carl, but I know what went wrong, and I think I can help fix it. I just need a chance." The neighborhood, still slightly hesitant, ultimately gave him that chance. Brady was elected unanimously at a follow-up meeting, along with a few other brave volunteers who pooled their expertise to form a board that valued fairness over control. But not everyone was thrilled. Even in exile, Karen managed to stir up trouble. Though her position as HOA president was gone, she still owned a home in Blackwood Estates, and she wasn't about to slink away quietly. "I built this neighborhood," she announced at a small but determined gathering of her remaining supporters in her backyard. "And this is the thanks I get. Have fun with your Boy Scout president and his clueless board. We'll see how long they last." Her loyalists, a small but vocal group, began to nitpick every decision Brady's board made. When landscaping schedules were adjusted slightly to accommodate budget shortfalls, they cried foul. When the new HOA allowed a trial period for non-regulation patio furniture, Karen's group spread flyers warning of impending neighborhood chaos. Brady brushed it off at first, focusing on rebuilding trust with the majority of residents. But it soon became clear that Karen's influence remained strong with a small but stubborn faction of the community. That's when the legal hurdles began popping up. During the Karen Carl era, contracts had been signed, many of them ironclad and full of fine print. The landscaping deals Carl had funneled money into, turns out they'd locked the HOA into a 5-year agreement that was ridiculously overpriced. Breaking the contract would cost thousands in penalties. Then there were the lawsuits. A handful of loyalists, spurred on by Karen's whispered encouragement, claimed that the new board's rule revisions were unfair or infringed on their rights. "We're trying to clean up her mess, and now we have to defend ourselves in court," Brady muttered during one late-night strategy meeting. "This is insane." Despite the setbacks, Brady didn't back down. He worked with residents like Susan and Jim to draft fair countermeasures and fundraisers to cover the legal fees. Meanwhile, the rest of us began noticing something surprising. Karen's once influential loyalists weren't as unified as they seemed. Gradually, stories began to trickle out. People who had once supported her leadership admitted that fines weren't the only thing Karen used to control them. "There was this one time," Susan said, leaning over her fence during one of our chats, "Karen threatened to review my garden choices if I didn't vote for her in the last election. Can you imagine?" Others came forward with tales of manipulation, backroom deals, and downright bullying. Karen's facade of competent leadership cracked further each time a new story was shared. By the time her group realized what was happening, their numbers had dwindled. By year's end, the transformation was undeniable. Brady's HOA operated under newly drafted bylaws that prioritized transparency. Fines were far less common, and when they did happen, it was for actual violations like dangerous tree branches or genuine property issues. Weekly neighborhood announcements kept everyone in the loop, and community input was encouraged for big decisions. It wasn't perfect, but the neighborhood felt less divided. For the first time in years, Blackwood Estates felt like a true community again. Karen, meanwhile, made an unceremonious exit. One morning, her house went up for sale, the sign standing crookedly in her empty front yard. No one seemed to miss her. Months later, during a small neighborhood cookout, Brady came up to me, holding a plate piled high with burgers. "Thanks for not giving up on this place," he said awkwardly. I laughed. "Don't thank me, you did all the hard work." Brady grinned but then added, "Still can't believe you're the chief of police and lived here without anyone knowing." "Yeah, stealth is part of the job," I joked, raising my soda. Blackwood Estates wasn't perfect, no place is. But as I glanced around at the group gathered on my lawn, neighbors chatting and kids playing, it struck me how far we'd come. We weren't just a collection of houses anymore. We were a community. And for the first time in years, Blackwood Estates finally felt like home. The end.